This is Ken from Coffee Crafters, and we're going to talk about how long to let your coffee rest after roasting before packaging and consumption. And if you want to get confused, go on the internet and research how long to let coffee rest. You will hear anything from 1 to 30 days. So we're going to look at it a little bit more from a scientific standpoint and kind of let you decide, but we have some recommendations on what we would do. Coffee shops will say anywhere from 4 to 5 days is kind of something I hear quite a bit from coffee shop owners on how long they'll let their coffee rest before it gets consumed, which is great for a coffee shop who's going to let their coffee rest and then it gets consumed in one day. But if you're packaging coffee for consumers at home, they're not going to consume that coffee in one day, we hope. So it's a little bit different for them. So let's look at the science behind it. There are 4 things that destroy coffee flavor: light, air, moisture, and heat. So our recommendation after roasting is to package the coffee immediately after roasting. Now, why would we do that? For one thing, we have to understand how flavor transfers through a bean. The CO2 in the bean, when it's off-gassing, especially when it's warm, carries the flavor with it. So we want to get that coffee into a coffee bag as quickly as possible, and we recommend only packaging your coffee in coffee bags with a one-way gas valve. What happens when you do that is the CO2 that's off-gassing inside the bean will push the oxygen out of the bag, and now you're storing that coffee in its own aroma. I look at coffee the same way as I look at fresh baked bread. When do you want that first slice of bread when it comes out of the oven? You're going to want it right away, right? That's when it's at its highest peak of flavor and aroma, and a coffee bean is the same way. So on the consumption curve, let's look at what happens when coffee is exposed to the environment. So if we're letting that coffee rest outside of the bag, a whole bean will off-gas in 7 to 9 days. So at room temperature, a whole bean off-gasses its CO2. So it's carrying the flavor compounds with it. It ends up something like bread that no longer smells like that fresh baked bread, right? A coffee bean does the same thing. Ground coffee will off-gas in 12 to 24 hours. So if you've ever seen a barista who was really picky about grinding that coffee and pressing it and drawing a shot through it right away, that's why they do that. Every time I hear them do that, I smile because they're doing it correctly. So definitely let your customers know too, if they have ground coffee, definitely store it in a one-way gas valve. Always squeeze the air out of the bag before you're storing it. You can learn more about that in our video on coffee storage and freshness. So let's look at what we would get out of this, of the science behind it. The science would tell us that a bean starts going downhill exposed to the atmosphere right away. You know, after 3 days, it starts going on that downhill cycle. We want to store that coffee right away. Let the customer decide, because whether it's ready to consume on day 1 or day 7 is really a personal preference. There's no way the roaster is going to know that. So package it right away in a one-way gas valve and have your customers consume it right away. I consume my coffee right away. I'm a coffee snob about how a coffee smells. As soon as it loses that fresh roasted aroma, I'm going to throw it out whether the coffee tastes good or not, because I need to smell that coffee when I make my coffee in the morning. So let coffee rest, package it right away, put it to your customers right away, let them decide when they consume it.